What is science fiction? Basically, science fiction explores what humanity would do in imagined scenarios that are related to science or technology. It imagines what strengths humans would exhibit, or which weaknesses would be brought out by that technology. It imagines what successes we might have, where we might do well, how our beauty would come out, but also what failures would come about, how the evil side of people would seize opportunities to be evil. How would we fail? All in relation to specific science and technology. That's why it's science fiction. It's not quite the same as all speculative fiction. I would say it's one subgenre of speculative fiction. But let's think a little bit more about what science fiction is. Science fiction ideas begin with sentences like, what if only, or if this goes on. Now, in Neil Gaiman's introduction to Fahrenheit 451, the 60th anniversary edition includes this introduction by him. That's what he says. He says science fiction begins with one of those three things. So this wasn't my idea. That's what Gaiman says. So I would pause now and read that introduction. You can find it online. It's also in my Canvas course. It's easy to find. But let's pause and read that. Okay. So where did science fiction start? Many people say that the first science fiction started with this question, when galvanism was first being discovered. They said, if our brain sends electronic signals to our muscles and a little bit of electricity is passed through them, and that's what makes us move and be alive, is little bits of electricity, what if the electric currents that made us alive were just passed through a dead body? Would that body come alive again? Can we bring people back to life with the electricity that keeps us alive in the first place? That question, the answer to that question, was explored in a book called Frankenstein. Arguably the first science fiction novel from 1818. Okay, Mary Shelley wrote that one. One of my favorite books ever. How about this one? Does this sound familiar? If only scientists could extract dinosaur DNA and bring them back to life. That would be Jurassic Park. You probably don't think of Jurassic Park as science fiction, but it definitely is. How about this? If this continues, totalitarian governments will use constant surveillance and propaganda to control every aspect of people's lives. That idea was explored in my favorite book, 1984. Okay? How about a book we read earlier this year? If this continues, a future society may burn books to suppress knowledge and control its citizens. You probably see through that one right away. Fahrenheit 451. What if the government made children fight to the death to decide which groups of people were fed and which people weren't? That's messed up. That's the Hunger Games. What if the government controlled people's lives, the truth, and everyone's behavior, but they let only one person in society know the truth and experience a full life? That's The Giver. Something most people read in 6th grade and don't realize how good it is until they reread it as an adult. There are 4 key kinds of sci-fi that we are going to focus on in this class. Now, you could argue that there are many subgenres of sci-fi, but we don't have unlimited time, so we're only going to talk about a few of them. Number 1 is speculative stories. Speculative stories imagine places or situations that might happen, or might have been our present if you change history, or if technology improved, specifically with technology, right? What would happen if this technology got to the point where we could do this or that or the other thing? They explore what humans would do in those situations with those technologies. Number 2, impossible stories. These include things that are currently impossible, very similar to speculative stories, but they give readers experiences that we could never actually have now. So it's this technology we know, like time travel, isn't actually going to be possible. But what if it were? It explores what humans would do if those impossible situations were possible. Speculative fiction is essentially this might be possible eventually. It just isn't yet. So what could it be like? Impossible stories are, we know this is impossible, but what if, right? Now, which of those categories a story fits into isn't so important, but it helps open our minds to not disqualify certain questions that we might be curious about exploring. Number 3 and 4 go together, dystopian or utopian stories. Now, the root dys means bad or abnormal or impaired, and u means good or well. Topia means place, so a dystopia is going to be a bad place. The kinds of worlds, the kinds of places where everything is bad and people are oppressed and poor all the time, everywhere, and there's just no hope. It's always a dark, dark, sad society. Utopias, on the other hand, are where everything is perfect and everything goes well and there's no disease and everyone is healthy and happy all the time, right? Hopefully. But what if technology made the whole world forever at war? Be a dystopia. What if there were a nuclear war that turned the whole world into a desert, right? Vegetation doesn't really grow much at all. Everyone's just fighting to stay alive in the middle of this Sahara-type environment. Those would be dystopias. But what if the world were free from disease from technologies? What if the world were protected from knowing anything bad or hurtful? We could just make people not know about those things, so it's this constant state of ignorance and bliss. These kinds of stories explore what humans would do in that kind of world. What's interesting is that most utopias are perfect, so it seems, but behind the scenes, behind deep into the government or whatever it is in this utopian world, turns out it's actually a dystopia, and there's a lot more sinister darkness going on than you can see at first. Examples would be The Hunger Games or Divergent, if you've read those series. The Giver is a wonderful example. Fahrenheit 451, okay? These seem like societies where everyone's happy and everything's fine and everything's good. But really, behind the scenes, it's pretty dark. So, in this quarter, we'll do some speculation. We'll think about what's impossible. We'll dive into these dystopian or utopian possibilities to create our own stories. But the question is, what makes a good sci-fi? Because I don't want you to just write sci-fi because I told you to. I want you to make something good that you're proud of, that other people would enjoy, that could be called quality. So the question is, what makes for good sci-fi? Now the answer is, good sci-fi is essentially just good literature that also falls under the category of science fiction. So then we have to ask, what makes good literature? And to get our answer, we're going to turn to the character Faber from Fahrenheit 451, which you read earlier this year. What makes good literature? Here's a quote from the novel. What does the word quality mean? To me, it means texture. This book has pores. It has features. This book can go under the microscope. You'd find life under the glass, streaming past in infinite profusion. The more pores, the more truthfully recorded details of life per square inch you can get on a sheet of paper, the more literary you are. That's my definition anyway. Telling detail, fresh detail. The good writers touch life often. The mediocre ones run a quick hand over her. The bad ones rape her and leave her for the flies. We are living in a time when flowers are trying to live on flowers instead of growing on good rain and black loam. Even fireworks, for all their prettiness, come from the chemistry of the earth. Yet somehow we think we can grow, feeding on flowers and fireworks, without completing the cycle back to reality. Do you know the story of Hercules and Antaeus, the giant wrestler whose strength was incredible so long as he stood firmly on the earth? But when he was held rootless in midair by Hercules, he perished easily. If there isn't something in that legend for us today, in this city, in our time, then I am completely insane. So, in other words, good literature accurately depicts the way that people are. That's what good literature does. So good sci-fi accurately explores the way people would be or might be when certain technology or situations come about that right now we can only imagine. So, in quarter 3, we talked quite a bit about theme, and our definition of theme was this. A theme is a universal human experience, something that everybody in every place and every time can relate to, but it's explored through the specific details in a text that maybe you can't relate to. And even if you don't understand these specific details because they're not part of your life, the characters and the people in the book, or maybe even the non-humans in the book, go through certain things that are universal to our human experience. So some common sci-fi themes would be exploration. I think everyone knows what it's like to explore, and they'd want to experience that. Survival. Everyone has to fight to survive, mostly. Manipulation. How do people control other people to get what they want? Personhood. What makes somebody a person, right? But there are also some constant sci-fi themes that you'll see in all of sci-fi, right? How people relate to technology. That is a key one. That's why it's science fiction. Because the way we relate to certain scientific things is going to be what is explored through all science fiction. That's why it's science fiction, okay? Or you could also rephrase it and say, how does a certain theme, any theme that's universal, how does that change with technology? How does technology change the way that a theme is explored in a novel? Okay? So we basically say any theme in the world plus science. So how would space travel affect the power of words and the impact that language has on people? How would the discovery of a new livable planet bring out the ways that humans have two sides to them, maybe a good part and an evil part, and we're not so simple to fall into only one category? How would robots affect our understanding of what is morally right and wrong, right? That's a good theme to explore in a lot of literature, but how would robots change that? How would new technology, in other words, how would new technology affect the way that you would explore the theme of resilience, compassion, language, morality? Any universal human theme might change under certain circumstances with certain new technologies. And that's what sci-fi explores. So, in the beginning of this video, we looked at this. Science fiction explores what humanity would do in imagined scenarios related to science and technology, what strengths and weaknesses would be brought out, what successes and failures would we find repeated by the human race in these scenarios. We begin by saying, what if this? If only that. If this goes on, humanity might, what? That's where you get to tell a story and take someone on an adventure to figure out what humanity might do and what we might learn about ourselves in a situation that hasn't even happened yet. That is the power of science fiction.